Now let's take a look at the concept of altimeter setting, and that's what you put in the little setting window of the altimeter. When you have the correct altimeter setting in here, that value is what you would set in the barometric pressure scale of the altimeter, and it would indicate true altitude at field elevation. So if you look on a map here, you see that the elevation of this airport is 756 feet. If you put the proper setting in the setting window of your altimeter and you're sitting on the ground at this airport, your altimeter should read 756 feet, and that's what altimeter setting is all about. Now, another case when the indicated altitude is equal to true altitude is at sea level under standard conditions, and they're going to ask you a question about that on the test. They're going to say, when is indicated altitude equal to true altitude? Well, one of those conditions is when you're parked on the ground with the proper setting in the setting window of the altimeter, and that's pretty common. Another case, far less common, is when you're at sea level under standard conditions. Then your indicated altitude would be equal to true altitude too. Not very common, so therefore they ask you a test question about it. Well, here's another test question. They ask you about altimeters on the FAA written exam, and that is they have you going from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And they say, all right, you do this, but you fail to reset the little setting window on your altimeter. What's going to happen? Well, let's take a look at it. First of all, when you're in an area of high pressure, instead of 29.92 at sea level, you might have 30.00 at sea level. And then you go up 1,000 feet from an area of high pressure, you might have 29 inches up 1,000 feet, and up another 1,000, about 28 inches. And that's really the way it works. For about each 1,000 feet of altitude you go up, the air pressure drops off about 1 inch of mercury. So let's assume that you are here in an area of high pressure, and that means you have 30.00 at sea level. And let's assume you take off and you climb to an indicated altitude of 1,000 feet. Well, at 1,000 feet, you'd actually be flying a pressure level of 29.00 because you got 30.00 set in a little setting window of the altimeter, and you're flying at an indicated altitude of 1,000 feet. You're really at the pressure level of 29.00. Now let's take a look and see what happens when you follow this pressure level, and that's what you're doing when you're flying an indicated altitude of 1,000 feet with 30.00 set in a setting window of your altimeter. You're following the 29.00 pressure level. So let's follow that pressure level and fly to an area of low pressure, and you can see what's going to happen. If you get to an area of low enough of pressure, eventually the 29.00 pressure level will be right down on the ground, and you're going to be in the trees. So here's what happens. If you fly from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure and fail to reset the setting window of the altimeter, your airplane will be too low. And there's an expression that pilots use for that, and the expression is, from high to low, look out below. And the reason you have to look out below is the airplane's too low. Now, pilots know this. Almost everybody knows this. So therefore, that's not the way the FAA asks you the question on the FAA written exam. The way they ask you the question in the test is you go from an area of high pressure to low pressure, what would your altimeter indicate? Well, with high to low, look out below means the airplane's too low. The reason the airplane's too low is because the altimeter is indicating too high. So if you go from high to low, the altimeter would indicate higher than actual altitude. Let's go the other way and do another one. This time, let's go from low pressure to high pressure. So here you are, start over here in an area of low pressure, and you fly up here to an area of high pressure. Well, the same saying works, it's backwards. Low to high, clear of the sky, means the airplane is too high. Why is the airplane too high? Because the altimeter is reading too low. So here's the way they ask it on the test. From low to high, what's your altimeter going to read? And your altimeter indicates too low. It indicates lower than actual altitude. Now, another thing you need to know is what happens when you adjust the setting window in the altimeter. Well, let you and I take a look and see what happens when you adjust the setting window in the altimeter. Notice in this particular case that we have 29.92 set in the setting window of the altimeter, and the hands are reading about 480 feet. Well, let's put a bigger number in the setting window of the altimeter. Now, notice when you do that, now we're getting up to 30-something or other, the hands are getting to be bigger numbers. So what you need to know is if you adjust the setting window on your altimeter to put a bigger number in this setting window of your altimeter, the hands will read bigger numbers. Now, another thing you need to know is how much a bigger number will the hands read? Well, the answer is you'll get 1,000 feet of altitude, indicated altitude change for each 1 inch of mercury. So if you change the setting window by 1 inch, you'll get a change in the hands by 1,000 feet. And if you put a bigger number in the setting window, the hands, that's 1 inch bigger, the hands will go up 1,000 feet. Now, as you might guess, they are going to ask you an FA test question about this, so let's take a look at the question they're going to ask you. They say, let's assume that it's necessary to set 29.85 in the altimeter after you had 29.15 in the altimeter. Okay, now what's going to happen? First of all, you put a bigger number in a setting window. That means the hands are going to read a bigger number. How much? Well, all you have to do is subtract, and this difference is 7/10 of an inch. Well, 1 inch is 1,000 feet, so 7/10 of an inch is going to be 7/10 of 1,000 feet. How much bigger will the hands read? You got it, 700 feet. Now, you got that figured out. There's another thing you know about the setting window of the altimeter that's interesting, and that is if you put 29.92 in the setting window of your altimeter, when you do that, your hands will read pressure altitude. So on the test, what do you need to know? You need to know if you want to find pressure altitude and you happen to be sitting in an airplane, simply put 29.92 in the setting window of your altimeter and your hands will indicate pressure altitude. Now, we talked about high to low, look out below, low to high, clear the sky, when we talked about going from low pressure to high pressure and high pressure to low pressure. Well, that same expression works by going from cold temperatures to warm temperatures and warm temperatures to cold temperatures. Let's you and I take a look at it. Here is a warm temperature situation. It's hotter in the daylights out there. Well, what you need to know is that on warm days, the pressure levels, the whole atmosphere actually gets taller. The pressure levels are raised, and the airplane's higher than the indicated altitude. That means the indicated altitude is lower than true altitude. Now, here's why. What happens is on days when the temperature is warmer than standard, the whole atmosphere actually gets taller. And on days when the temperature is colder than standard, the whole atmosphere actually gets lower. There's no lid on the atmosphere, so when the temperatures rise, the whole atmosphere actually gets taller like this. Now, what that means then is if you're flying at an indicated altitude of 10,000 feet, actually the true altitude of the airplane on warm days might be as high as, we'll say, 11 or 12,000 feet. The airplane is higher than the indicated altitude. And the expression works. Low to high, clear the sky, means the airplane is going to be higher in warm temperatures. That works for low temperatures to high temperatures, means the airplane is going to be higher. We all understand that, makes great sense to pilots, so therefore they're not going to ask us that way. Here's the way they're going to ask the question on the FAA written exam. They say you fly to temperatures warmer than standard. What's the indicated altitude going to be compared to true altitude? And the answer is the indicated altitude will be lower than true altitude. Let's take a look at that one more time. The indicated altitude is still 10,000 feet, but the true altitude might be 11 or 12,000. The indicated is lower than the actual true altitude of the aircraft. Okay, once again, if you go to cold temperatures, high to low, look out below, fly into cold temperatures, means the airplane's going to be too low. Let's take a look at the way they're going to ask you about this on the test. Here's the way it goes. They're going to say you fly in colder than standard temperatures. They're going to ask you, in this case, what is the true altitude of the aircraft? Well, the true altitude is lower than the indicated altitude.